A man stands up in a crowded assembly hall. He is not shouting. He is not threatening anyone. He simply raises his hand and makes a suggestion. Maybe, he says, we should at least listen to what Persia is offering. His name is Lycidas. He is a councillor of Athens, and in the next few minutes, he will be dead. The other councillors do not argue with him. They do not vote him down. They surround him where he stands and stone him to death on the floor of the assembly hall. Then word spreads outside. The women of Athens hear what Lycidas said. They find his house. They drag his wife and children into the street, and they stone them to death too. No trial, no debate, no mercy for the children. This was Athens in the spring of 479 BC, a city of refugees living on borrowed time, a city that had already watched its homes burn twice, a city so deep in collective trauma that the price of suggesting peace was death for your entire family. These were not barbarians acting on impulse. Athens was one of the most intellectually sophisticated cities in the ancient world, and yet when Lycidas stood up and said the word negotiation, something snapped. The room did not debate him. The room killed him. And when the women outside heard what he had said, they went to his house and made sure his family could never produce another man who might say the same thing. That is what sustained trauma does to a community. It does not make people less human. It makes them human in ways that are very difficult to look at. We talk about Thermopylae constantly, the 300 Spartans, the hot gates, the last stand. It is one of the most retold stories in human history. And the reasons are not hard to find. It is a perfect story. Brave men, clear enemy, hopeless odds, beautiful death. It ends at exactly the right moment, before anything gets complicated. But here is what that perfect story leaves out. The 300 died. Persia kept marching. The Persian army walked through the pass, swept into central Greece, and kept moving south. Athens was evacuated in a desperate scramble. The city that would produce Socrates, Sophocles, and Pericles was reduced to smoke and ash, and the Persian army was still completely intact. Still on Greek soil, still waiting. Thermopylae gave Greece a legend. What it did not give Greece was a victory. What it did not do was end the war. What it did not do was send Persia home. Something else did that. Something that happened the following year on a dusty plain in a region called Boeotia, in a battle that most people today could not name if you offered them money to do it. This is the story of Plataea, the battle that ended the second Persian invasion of mainland Greece, fought not by 300 perfect warriors dying in a narrow pass, but by tens of thousands of men, including a staggering number who were legally classified as property, stumbling through one of the most chaotic military operations in the ancient world, and somehow pulling off a victory that changed the course of history. The question is not just how they won. The question is what that victory actually cost, what it did to the men who achieved it, what it did to the general who commanded it, and why. After all of it, the world decided it preferred a story about people who lost. That question does not have a comfortable answer, but it has an honest one. And that is what we are going to find. Here is the thing that gets quietly skipped over in most versions of this story. Thermopylae was not the end of anything. It was a delaying action that delayed approximately 3 days. Persia lost a few thousand soldiers in the pass, which by the scale of the forces involved was barely a rounding error. Greece lost its best natural defensive position north of the Peloponnese, its most celebrated living general, and any realistic hope of stopping the invasion before it reached the heartland. The Persian army came through the pass and swept south. Athens was evacuated. The entire civilian population of the most important city in Greece was loaded onto ships and ferried to the island of Salamis and the shores of the Peloponnese. They watched from the water as Persian soldiers climbed the Acropolis and burned the temples. They could see the smoke from across the strait. Families who had lived in Athens for generations watched their homes disappear into fire from a distance close enough to smell it. Then the Greek fleet won the Battle of Salamis, and the narrative of the Persian Wars, in most popular tellings, ends there. Xerxes goes home. Greece is saved. Everybody celebrates. Except Persia did not go home. Not entirely. Not the part that mattered most at that particular moment. A general named Mardonius stayed. He had been given command of a hand-picked force and a specific mandate. He was not there to hold territory the way an occupying army holds territory. He was executing a plan. The plan was to use the winter to negotiate, apply pressure, divide the Greek alliance, and when that failed, to win the war militarily in the spring. And when negotiations with Athens broke down, Mardonius did something that most popular histories mention briefly and then move past quickly. He marched his army south and burned Athens a second time. Not merely out of anger. The strategic message was deliberate and precise. I am still here. I have been here all winter. I will be here next winter as well. And I have more patience than you do. Sparta, at this moment, was not moving. This is the part of the heroic narrative that gets edited out most aggressively. While Mardonius was torching Athens for the second time, while Athenian refugees were watching their city burn again from across the water, the Spartans were sitting behind a defensive wall they had spent the winter building across the Isthmus of Corinth. The wall protected the Peloponnese. It protected Sparta. It protected the southern peninsula where the Spartan citizen class lived and owned land and kept their slaves. It did not protect Athens. It did not protect any of the Greek territory north of that narrow neck of land. And the Spartans knew this. The Athenian message to Sparta was not a plea. Herodotus records the pressure directly. Athens told Sparta that if Spartan armies did not march north immediately, Athens would have no practical alternative but to accept whatever terms Mardonius was offering. And if Athens accepted Persian terms, the Athenian fleet, the largest and most effective Greek navy in existence, the fleet that had just won at Salamis, would sail under Persian command. Thucydides, writing a generation later about the foundations of Athenian sea power, helps us understand exactly why that threat carried weight. Athens had the means to make it happen. A Persian fleet reinforced by Athenian triremes would have made the Peloponnese impossible to defend. Sparta's wall across the isthmus would have become a very expensive piece of useless stonework. Sparta moved. Not because of loyalty, not because of principle, because the strategic arithmetic had become impossible to ignore. The ephors issued the mobilization order overnight. 5,000 Spartiates were called up, and alongside them, according to Herodotus, approximately 35,000 helots were armed and ordered to march. That number is not a footnote. It is the centre of the story, and it demands more than a passing mention. Who exactly were these 35,000 people? What did it mean that they were marching? And why does almost every popular account of Plataea find a way to mention them briefly and then quietly move on? Those are the questions that the next part of this story is going to answer, because the answers change everything about what the word victory means when applied to what happened at Plataea. Let us stop and talk about what we actually mean when we say the Spartans, because there is a version of this story that gets told in classrooms and movies and documentary narrations, and it goes something like this. The Spartans were the greatest warriors in the ancient world, disciplined beyond any other people, fearless, legendary, the spiritual descendants of the 300, and when they finally marched to face Persia at Plataea, they did what Spartans do. They fought. They won. They saved Greece. That version is not wrong exactly, but is missing something so large that leaving it out changes the entire meaning of what happened. The Spartan army that marched north in 479 BC was not an army of Spartan warriors. It was an army in which Spartan warriors were a minority. A significant minority. 5,000 of the most rigorously trained soldiers in the ancient world. Yes, but a minority nonetheless. Surrounded on all sides by people who were either allied city-state troops fighting under political obligation, or helo. And there were a lot of helots. Herodotus gives us a specific ratio. For every single Spartiate, the citizen warrior class, approximately 7 helots marched alongside him. The exact totals Herodotus provides are debated among modern historians, as ancient military numbers generally are, and even the ratio itself depends on trusting his account. But the larger point survives scrutiny. 5,000 Spartiates, and approximately 35,000 helots from the Spartan force alone, combined with allied Peloponnesian troops, the Athenians, and contingents from a dozen other Greek city-states. The total force that assembled near the slopes of Mount Cithaeron numbered well over 100,000 men by ancient accounts. We remember 300. We forget the 100,000. And we especially forget the 35,000 who were not even legally considered people by the society they were fighting for. Think about what it meant to be a helot in that army. You were born into a system specifically designed to keep you afraid. Ancient sources describe the Crypteia as a system of state-sanctioned violence against the helot population, one in which young Spartan men could be dispatched into the countryside to terrorize and kill helots. Later writers understood this as part of Sparta's deliberate machinery of social control, a way of ensuring that a population that significantly outnumbered its masters never developed the collective confidence required to revolt. Helots were not allowed to own weapons under normal circumstances. They were not allowed to accumulate wealth. They were not allowed to leave. Generations of your family had lived and died under these conditions. And now a Spartan officer was handing you a spear and telling you to march. The question that history does not record, because the people who could have answered it were not the ones writing things down, is what the helots thought about all of this. Did they fight because they hoped military service might earn them something? Did they fight because refusing meant death where they stood? Did some of them fight because Persia represented a genuine threat to a world they lived in too, even if that world had never treated them as fully human? We do not know. Herodotus does not tell us. The helots left no written record. What we know is that they marched, that they carried supplies and weapons and the operational infrastructure of the Spartan army, that they fought when the battle came, and that when it was over, the victory was recorded under the names of Spartan commanders, and the 35,000 were absorbed back into the silence from which they had briefly and bloodily emerged. They saved Greece. Greece did not save them. The army that vanished from the Peloponnese before sunrise was enormous, built on a foundation that the victory monuments would never mention. When the Athenian envoys arrived to continue their argument, a Spartan official informed them with the economy of language that Spartans considered a virtue that there was nothing left to argue about. The columns were already moving through the dark toward the northern roads. What those columns were marching toward was a trap set by the most dangerous military mind Persia had left in Greece. A man who had spent an entire winter preparing for exactly this moment. And almost nobody today remembers his name either. Popular history has a habit of doing something subtle but consistent to the enemies of people it wants to celebrate. It does not usually make them cowardly. Cowardly enemies make for boring stories. Instead, it makes them arrogant. It gives them one fatal flaw, one blind spot, one moment of hubris that explains why they lost despite having every apparent advantage. It makes the defeat feel inevitable in retrospect, which makes the victory feel less like a product of chaos and luck, and more like the natural outcome of superior virtue. Mardonius has been treated this way for 2,500 years. The version of Mardonius that most people absorb, if they encounter him at all, is a capable but overconfident general who made the mistake of underestimating Greek warriors and paid for it with his life. He exists in the story to make Pausanias look good by comparison. He is the man who had every advantage and threw it away. Read Herodotus carefully. Understanding that Herodotus was a Greek writing for a Greek audience about a Greek victory, and a more complicated figure starts to emerge. Mardonius was not a man who stumbled into command through royal connections. He had campaigned in Europe before the main invasion. He understood the Greek city-state political system well enough to run a sophisticated diplomatic operation through the winter of 479 BC, playing Athens against Sparta, and coming genuinely close to fracturing the alliance without fighting a single battle. That diplomatic campaign is itself a story that most accounts skip, because a Persian general who nearly won through politics rather than force does not fit the narrative of inevitable Greek triumph. He also chose his own army, and this decision tells you more about the man than almost anything else. When Xerxes went home after Salamis, he left Mardonius with permission to take whatever forces he needed for the spring campaign. Mardonius did not take everything. He specifically did not take the vast conscript forces. The hundreds of thousands of bodies assembled for the original invasion, more to project the image of overwhelming power than to function as an effective fighting force. He sent them home. What he kept was something very different in character and capability: the Immortals. The 10,000-man elite infantry corps that served as the standing professional heart of the Persian army. Not conscripts handed a spear 6 months before the campaign. Career soldiers in the most powerful military institution on earth. Men who trained continuously, who were replaced immediately when they fell, so the unit never dropped below full strength. Who had spent careers learning the craft of war across an empire stretching from Egypt to the borders of India. The Saka horse archers from the Central Asian steppes. Riders who had been on horseback since before they could walk. Who could fire composite bows from a moving horse with a rate and accuracy that Greek armies had no reliable answer to in open terrain. Not auxiliary troops filling a gap in the order of battle. A weapon system that Greek hoplite tactics had been specifically designed to avoid confronting on flat ground. Heavy infantry from the eastern satrapies. Professional soldiers who had spent careers on campaign in some of the most demanding environments on earth. This was not a weakened army. This was a scalpel made from the sharpest pieces of a much larger weapon. Then Mardonius chose his ground. He moved his army north into the flat plains of Boeotia, near the city of Thebes, which had already submitted to Persia and would serve as a base of local support. He set up camp along the Asopus River on the flat. Open ground where his cavalry could operate at full effectiveness. Ground where the phalanx, the Greek formation that was nearly unstoppable in a straight frontal engagement on level terrain with secure flanks, could be approached from multiple directions by fast-moving horsemen who could harass it, encircle it, and cut its supply lines without ever needing to meet it head-on. He built a fortified stockade that served simultaneously as a defensive base, a supply depot, and a fallback position, and then he did something that separated him from commanders who simply react to their enemies. He waited, not passively, actively. He used the time to probe Greek intentions, to maintain cavalry pressure on Greek supply lines, and to let the fundamental instability of a coalition built from city-states that had spent most of the previous century fighting each other do its slow work. Here is a specific detail that captures who Mardonius was better than any general description. When the two armies had been facing each other across the Asopus River for several days, a Theban leader named Timogenidas came to Mardonius and suggested a direct assault on the Greek position. Mardonius declined. He looked at the rocky slopes where the Greeks were positioned, understood exactly why Pausanias had chosen that ground, and chose to maintain the pressure of his cavalry operations rather than charge into terrain designed to neutralize his greatest advantage. That is not arrogance. That is a general who reads a battlefield and makes the disciplined choice over the dramatic one. He came closer to winning this campaign without a decisive engagement than almost any account of Plataea acknowledges. He came closer to winning it not with the Immortals or the horse archers, not with any weapon that appears in any painting about this battle. He almost won it with thirst. And that story starts in the rocky foothills of Mount Cithaeron, where two armies sat facing each other for 11 days, each waiting for the other to make the mistake that would decide everything. Picture the scene. Two armies, separated by a river. On the northern bank, one of the finest professional military forces the ancient world had ever assembled, sitting in a fortified camp with full supplies, cavalry ready to move in any direction, and a commander who had spent the entire winter preparing for exactly this moment. On the southern side, spread across the rocky lower slopes of Mount Cithaeron, a coalition of over 100,000 men from city-states that had spent most of the previous century fighting each other, eating through supplies that had to travel over mountain passes to reach them, baking under a Greek summer sun in bronze armour that turned into a furnace by mid-morning. For 11 days, nothing happened. Not nothing in the sense that both sides sat quietly and rested. Nothing in the sense that neither side initiated the engagement the other side was positioned to win. It was 11 days of watching, probing, repositioning, and the particular kind of psychological pressure that does not leave marks on the body but hollows out the mind with remarkable efficiency. Pausanias had made one genuinely smart decision before the standoff began. He had positioned the Greek army on the lower slopes of Mount Cithaeron rather than on the flat ground of the Boeotian plain. This looks obvious in retrospect. It was not obvious at the time, and it required resisting the pressure from Allied commanders who wanted to move down to the plain and force a decisive engagement immediately. On the rocky slopes of Cithaeron, the Persian cavalry was almost entirely neutralized. Horses do not accelerate well on loose stone and uneven ground. The tight wheeling maneuvers that made the Saka horse archers so devastating on flat terrain became clumsy and dangerous on a hillside. Mardonius could not use his most powerful mobile weapon effectively against an enemy that stayed in the hills, and Pausanias knew it. Mardonius, for his part, could not simply charge his infantry up the slope into a prepared Greek position. The phalanx at the top of an incline, with the high ground and the defensive advantage, was exactly the combination that had cost Persia so dearly at Thermopylae. He was not going to repeat that mistake on a larger scale. He needed the Greeks on flat ground, and the Greeks were not coming down, so both sides waited. And the waiting became its own kind of combat. The Persian cavalry was not idle. Mardonius sent his horsemen forward regularly to harass, to probe, and to maintain the psychological pressure he hoped would eventually force the Greek coalition into a mistake. Riders would sweep toward the Greek lines, loose volleys of arrows at close range, and wheel away before the slower Greek infantry could effectively respond. It was a tactic designed to make the enemy feel hunted on their own ground, to make every hour of waiting feel like an hour of being slowly worn down by an enemy that was always moving and never quite within reach. The Greek coalition was feeling it. Different city-state commanders had different thresholds for what counted as acceptable suffering. And 11 days of arrow harassment while consuming finite supplies on a rocky hillside was testing all of them. Then came Mecistius, and for a few hours, everything changed. He was the senior Persian cavalry commander, a figure of such prominence that his horse was a Nisaean stallion, the largest and most prized breed in the Persian world, with a bridle made of gold. These were not vanity accessories. In the ancient world, they were readable markers of authority that every soldier on both sides could understand at a glance. When Mecistius rode forward personally, the signal was unmistakable. The finest cavalry mind in the Persian army had decided this particular harassment needed his direct involvement. He led a squadron of horsemen up toward the Greek position near a section of the line held by the Megarians, one of the smaller Greek contingents. The Megarians were taking the worst of it. The cavalry was riding in close, loosing arrows at nearly point-blank range for horsemen, and the Megarians were pinned down behind their shields, taking casualties, unable to fight back against an enemy that was always moving. They sent an urgent message to Pausanias. Either send reinforcements or we are going to break. Pausanias asked for volunteers to go down and support the Megarians against cavalry on open ground. It was not an attractive assignment. 300 Athenian volunteers stepped forward, along with archers. The number echoes Thermopylae deliberately in Herodotus's telling, and the parallel was not lost on the Greeks present. What followed was chaotic in the way that small unit actions under fire tend to be chaotic. The Athenians moved forward. The archers began returning fire, and in the confusion of the skirmish, an arrow struck the flank of the horse carrying Mecistius. The wound was serious enough to make the animal rear violently and throw its rider. Mecistius hit the ground in full armour. The soldiers who reached him first could not kill him. He was wearing scale armour beneath his outer garments, layered protection that turned away sword strokes and spear thrusts from the men hacking at him on the ground. He was fighting back, a large man in near impenetrable protection, holding off multiple attackers simultaneously. Their weapons were finding no purchase on the armour covering his torso and limbs. Then one soldier found the gap, not through the armour, through the helmet, a thrust into the narrow opening at the visor, and the most celebrated cavalry commander in the Persian army died on a Greek hillside, not through superior tactics or a planned manoeuvre, through one desperate improvisation in the chaos of a brawl. The Persian cavalry charged immediately to recover his body. The Greeks held their ground. They kept the body. When Mecistius was carried back through the Greek lines on a cart and displayed to the assembled army, the effect on morale was immediate and disproportionate to what had actually occurred militarily. One skirmish. One commander dead. No strategic position changed. No tactical situation altered. But the roar that went through the Greek camp when the soldiers saw the body was the roar of men who had been waiting 11 days for proof that the enemy could be hurt. Across the river, the Persian camp fell into genuine grief. Herodotus describes soldiers cutting their hair, horses and mules being shorn as well. The entire camp filled with mourning for a man who had been, in some meaningful sense, the human embodiment of Persian cavalry confidence. Pausanias, watching the reaction in his own camp, knew something had shifted. Morale, which had been eroding under 11 days of arrow harassment and supply anxiety, had snapped back in a single afternoon. His men were ready to fight. The problem was that readiness and opportunity are two different things. His army was still on a hillside. Mardonius was still on the plain. And the practical reality of the Greek position, the water running low, the supply convoys increasingly threatened in the mountain passes, the coalition fraying at its political seams, had not changed because of one dead Persian commander. Pausanias needed water. He needed to move his army closer to a reliable source. And that single, unavoidable practical necessity was about to give Mardonius the opening. He had been patiently engineering for 11 days. There is a version of military history that focuses almost entirely on battles, on the moments of clash, the charge, the line that holds or breaks, the commander who makes the right call at the decisive instant. It is an understandable focus. Those moments are dramatic. They compress enormous complexity into a single legible image. But the version of Plataea that begins with the battle misses the part of this story that should genuinely terrify you. Because for 8 days before any Greek soldier crossed any river with a spear in his hand, Mardonius came closer to winning this campaign than almost any account of the battle acknowledges. He came closer to winning it not with the immortals, not with his cavalry archers, not with any weapon that appears in any monument or painting about this battle. He won it with thirst. After the death of Mecistius, Pausanias made a decision that was tactically understandable and strategically dangerous. His army had been on the slopes of Cithaeron for 11 days. The supply situation was becoming critical. The mountain passes behind the Greek position were the only routes by which food could reach the army. And those passes were increasingly subject to Persian cavalry harassment. More immediately, the water sources on the high ground were limited and increasingly inadequate for an army of over 100,000 men in the Greek summer. There was a spring in the foothills below the current Greek position, closer to the river, called the Gargaphia Spring. It was reliable. It was clean. And it was close enough to potentially supply an army of this size. Pausanias moved the Greek force down from the higher slopes to a new position near the spring. It seemed like a reasonable solution to a genuine problem. Mardonius watched them move and said nothing. He did not order an immediate attack. He did not send his cavalry forward to contest the new position. He simply watched, and then he began making adjustments. Quietly, precisely, with the patience of a man who understands that his opponent has just extended his neck, and that the correct response is not to grab immediately but to make the grip inevitable. The first move Mardonius made was against the supply lines. The mountain passes behind the Greek army were the only connection between the force at Plataea and the Peloponnese. Everything the army needed: food, replacement equipment, fresh animals, came through those passes. A convoy of 500 supply wagons was moving through the passes toward the Greek position, carrying enough provisions to meaningfully extend the army's operational capacity. Persian cavalry found the convoy in the passes. They did not attempt to capture it. They destroyed it. The wagons were burned. The animals killed. The drivers slaughtered. 500 wagons of supplies gone in the kind of action that takes 2 sentences to describe and perhaps 2 hours to execute, but had an immediate and irreversible effect on the situation facing 100,000 men. The Greek army was now cut off from resupply. Mardonius still did not attack. He moved to the second pressure point. His cavalry began systematic operations against the Gargaphia Spring. Not a single dramatic assault. A sustained, methodical campaign designed to make the spring unusable. Persian horsemen drove through the area repeatedly, churning the ground around the water source, muddying the approaches, making access increasingly dangerous for the Greek soldiers who needed to reach it. According to Herodotus, they eventually succeeded in fouling the spring itself, filling it with debris until the water that had been the entire justification for moving the army down from the high ground was no longer drinkable. The only reliable water source for over 100,000 men had been destroyed. Sit with what that means for a moment. You are a soldier in the Greek coalition army. You have been in the field for weeks. You have been standing on the slopes of a mountain in a Greek summer, wearing bronze armour that absorbs heat like a pan on a fire. You have watched your food supplies dwindle as the mountain passes became increasingly dangerous for supply convoys. And now the spring that your entire army relocated its position to access has been deliberately destroyed. And the river where clean water is available is held on the far bank by the finest cavalry army in the world. You cannot go forward without crossing the river into open ground where Persian cavalry will tear your formation apart before you reach the other bank. You cannot stay where you are because you have no water and no food coming. You cannot go back without the movement being interpreted as retreat, which in the political reality of a fragile coalition of city-states with their own pride and their own domestic audiences back home could cause the entire alliance to dissolve before the army even reaches safety. This is not a dramatic battlefield crisis. There is no single moment of decision, no charge to make or ridge to hold. It is the slow, grinding, almost administrative process of an army being strangled by logistics. And it is far more representative of how military campaigns have actually been decided throughout history than anything that happened on the day of the battle itself. For 8 days, this is what Plataea looked like. Not two armies in the clash of bronze and iron that the paintings show, two armies in a stalemate, with one of them slowly running out of everything it needed to continue existing as a coherent fighting force. Mardonius understood something that the popular narrative of this battle consistently undervalues. The Greek coalition was inherently more fragile than its military strength suggested. It was an alliance of city-states with independent political interests, independent military commands, and no unified authority that could compel obedience when things became genuinely difficult. Every day the army sat without food and water. That fragility increased. Every day the Persian cavalry controlled the surrounding countryside. The psychological pressure on the coalition partners grew. Every day that passed without a decisive engagement, the calculation for the smaller city-state contingents became harder to hold together. The Greek alliance was not going to be broken by Persian spears. It was going to be broken by the sun, by empty stomachs, by dry throats, and by the very human tendency of men under sustained pressure to start asking whether the people giving them orders actually know what they are doing. Mardonius had not fired an arrow or thrown a spear in 8 days, and he was winning. Then, on the 8th day, Pausanias called his commanders together. He laid out the situation with the kind of directness that circumstances requiring brutal honesty demand. They could not stay. They could not advance. The only remaining option was a controlled withdrawal at night to a position closer to fresh water and the mountain, where they could regroup and reassess. The plan was sound. The execution was going to be something else entirely. There is a specific kind of military disaster that does not come from the enemy. It comes from the inside, from exhaustion, from fractured command structures, from the gap between what a plan looks like on paper and what it looks like when you try to execute it in darkness with over 100,000 hungry, thirsty men who have not slept properly in days and who represent a dozen different city-states with a dozen different ideas about who is actually in charge. The night of the planned Greek withdrawal to the island is that kind of disaster, and it came very close to ending the Persian wars in the worst possible way for Greece. The plan itself was not irrational. A position the Greeks called the island, a piece of ground near the town of Plataea itself, offered proximity to a water source, defensibility against cavalry, and access to the mountain passes. A fighting withdrawal to better ground, executed cleanly, would reset the strategic situation without conceding the campaign entirely. The execution requirements were brutal in a way that the plan's logic could not fully account for. Over 100,000 men needed to move simultaneously, in complete silence, in the middle of the night, across several miles of unfamiliar ground, to a coordinated position, without alerting a Persian army camped close enough that a man raising his voice would have been heard across the river. The movement needed to be coordinated across multiple independent contingents with their own commanders, their own pride, their own interpretation of what the orders actually meant, and their own instinct for self-preservation that 8 days of stress and deprivation had sharpened to a very fine edge. The centre of the Greek line moved first, and then it did not stop where it was supposed to stop. The contingents from Corinth, Megara, and the other allied city-states that held the middle of the Greek formation did not withdraw to the island. They withdrew to the town of Plataea itself. They kept going past the agreed position, past the defensible ground Pausanias had identified, all the way to the Temple of Hera on the outskirts of the town, where they stopped, set down their shields, and effectively removed themselves from the battle entirely. Whether this was panic, misunderstood orders, deliberate self-preservation, or some combination of all three, Herodotus does not say with certainty. What he does say is that when the sun came up, the centre of the Greek line was not at the island. It was miles away, clustered around a temple, taking no further part in what was about to happen. In a single night, without a Persian sword being raised, Pausanias had lost approximately half his army, but that was not the worst problem he faced in those hours before dawn. On the right wing, where the Spartans and their Tegean allies were positioned, the withdrawal order triggered a confrontation that borders on the genuinely unbelievable given what was at stake. The commander of the Python unit, a Spartan formation of considerable prestige and a long institutional history, was a man named Amompharitus. When the order to withdraw reached him, he refused it, not questioned it, not requested clarification, refused it, flatly, completely, with a physical directness that left no room for interpretation. His reasoning was exactly what you would expect from a man raised inside the Spartan cultural system from childhood. A man who had spent his entire adult life absorbing the lesson that Thermopylae had just burnt into the consciousness of every Spartan alive. The 300 had not retreated. They had died at their post. That was what Spartans did. Retreat. Regardless of the tactical justification. Regardless of the strategic necessity. Regardless of what the commanding general had ordered in the middle of the night. It was incompatible with what it meant to be a Spartan soldier. He would not bring shame on his city by running from strangers. That was the word he used. Strangers. The Persians were strangers. And he would not run from them. Pausanias, the regent of Sparta, the supreme commander of the entire Greek coalition, was now standing in the dark in a screaming argument with one of his own officers. The clock was running toward dawn. The Persian army was sleeping 200 meters away across a river, and the man Pausanias needed to move was not moving. The argument became physical. Amompharitus reached down, picked up a large boulder from the riverbed, a stone heavy enough that the act of lifting it required visible effort, and slammed it down at Pausanias's feet. In Spartan democratic tradition, citizens voted by casting pebbles. Amompharitus was casting his vote with a rock the size of a man's torso. With this pebble, he announced, I vote that we do not flee from the strangers. It would almost be funny if the stakes were not quite so catastrophic. On the left side of the Greek formation, the Athenians had been waiting for the Spartans to begin moving first, as the plan required. The Spartans were not moving. The Athenians sent a messenger across to find out what was happening. The messenger found the Spartan command in the middle of an argument with a subordinate officer who was making his position clear with geology. At 2 in the morning, while an entire army waited in the dark, the Athenian messenger returned to report that the situation was unclear. Pausanias made the only decision available to him. He would move the rest of the Spartan force and leave Amompharitus behind. It was a calculated gamble built on a reasonably accurate reading of Spartan psychology. Once Amompharitus saw that his comrades were actually leaving, the cultural imperative to not abandon your brothers in the field would override the cultural imperative to not appear to retreat. He would follow. He would hate every step of it. But he would follow. The gamble was correct. but it consumed time that was already running out. The main Spartan column began moving south. Slowly, stopping repeatedly to look back. The pace of men who are hoping to be wrong about the choice they just made. Amompharetus waited until the last possible moment, until the darkness ahead of him was empty, and the darkness behind him was full of Persian sentries who would be waking up to a new shift very soon. And then he ordered his men to pick up their shields and march after the column. By the time the Spartan formation had reassembled into something resembling a coherent unit, the sky above Mount Cithaeron was beginning to change. The black was softening to the grey that comes before dawn. The birds were starting. The air was beginning to carry the particular quality of light that tells anyone who has ever been awake to see it that the night is running out. From the Persian camp across the river, the sentries on the night watch were rubbing their eyes and looking at the Greek position. The centre of the line was gone. On the right side, where the Spartans had been, there was movement, not the organised, stationary presence of an army in its position, but scattered movement. A long disorganised line of men on the open slopes, strung out and separated, moving away from the river in a formation that from across the water in the first grey light of morning looked like exactly one thing. It looked like an army that had broken and was running. The sentry who reported this to Mardonius's tent did not know he was about to trigger the most consequential misreading of a battlefield situation in the entire Persian wars. He only knew what he saw, and what he saw, from where he stood, in that particular light, was the answer to 8 days of waiting. Mardonius came out of his tent in the early morning light and looked across the river. What he saw was genuinely ambiguous. The centre of the Greek line was gone. On the right side of the Greek position, the Spartans were visible but not in battle formation. They were strung out in a long, irregular column on the open slopes, still absorbing the last of Amompharetus's unit into the main body, moving in a way that from across a river in the first grey light of morning could be read as organised tactical repositioning, or could be read as a disintegrating army trying to flee before full daylight exposed their situation completely. Mardonius read it as flight. And here is the thing about that reading, that history tends to skip over in its rush to explain what happened next. It was not an unreasonable conclusion given everything Mardonius knew at that moment. He had spent 8 days systematically creating the conditions for exactly this outcome. He had destroyed the food supply. He had fouled the water. He had applied continuous cavalry pressure that had visibly fractured the coalition's morale. When those conditions appeared to have produced the result he had been engineering, the most natural human response was not to question the appearance but to act on it. There is a name for what happened to Mardonius in that moment. It describes what occurs when a person under pressure, in possession of incomplete information, in a situation where the desire for a particular outcome has been building for days or weeks, encounters something ambiguous and interprets it through the lens of what they most want to see rather than what is actually there. Mardonius had spent 8 days wanting to see the Greek coalition fall apart. When something that looked like falling apart appeared in front of him, he saw confirmation rather than ambiguity. He turned to his commanders with an expression that Herodotus describes as contemptuous. He pointed at the Spartan column on the slopes across the river. He reminded his officers of Sparta's legendary reputation for refusing to retreat, the reputation built at Thermopylae and celebrated throughout the Greek world. And then he asked them, with the particular bitterness of a man who feels a long-held expectation finally confirmed, whether these were the men who never ran. Because they were running now. He did not wait for his infantry to form up properly. He did not wait for his cavalry to position itself for a coordinated assault. He did not send scouts across the river to confirm what he was seeing before committing his army to action. He pointed at the retreating red cloaks and gave the order to advance. The Persian army crossed the Asopus River in a rush, cavalry leading, infantry following without the careful dressing of ranks that a deliberate assault would have required. It was the movement of an army that believed it was pursuing broken prey rather than engaging a prepared enemy. And in the dust and noise of that crossing, in the urgency of men who believed they were finally delivering the killing blow they had been preparing for weeks, the distinction between those two things was not immediately apparent. Pausanias heard them coming before he saw them. The sound of a large cavalry force crossing a river and moving at speed is not subtle. It carries. He turned and looked back toward the Asopus and saw the dust cloud rising above the Persian advance. Then he looked at his own army and made the assessment that a commander in his position had to make quickly and accurately. The Athenians were far away on the left, separated by miles of ground and the hills that blocked line of sight between the two wings. He could not reach them in time. The Allied centre was gone entirely, clustered around a temple miles away. Amompharetus's unit had just rejoined the column, and the formation was still not fully consolidated. He had the Spartans and the Tegeans, two contingents, without the rest of the coalition, about to receive the full weight of a Persian army that believed it was delivering the final blow to a broken enemy. He stopped the column. He turned his men to face the river, and then he called for the sacrificial animals, the Battle of Plataea, the engagement that would determine the future of independent Greek resistance against Persia, was about to be decided in part by the condition of a goat's liver, and the reasons for that are more interesting and more psychologically sophisticated than they might initially appear to someone looking back from 2,500 years away. Here is what was actually happening on that hillside while the Persian army was crossing the river. Arrows were coming in. Not a few arrows. Volleys. The Persian infantry had planted their wicker shields in the ground in a long line along the river bank, and their archers were firing from behind that improvised wall in continuous rotation. One rank loosing while another drew, maintaining a rate of fire that was putting enough projectiles into the air that men were dying without the battle having officially started. The Tegean allies on the Spartan flank were watching their comrades fall and beginning to shift their weight forward with the particular restlessness of soldiers whose training is telling them to charge and whose orders are telling them to hold. And Pausanias was kneeling over a goat. The first set of entrails came out wrong. The omens were bad. In the Greek military religious tradition, this was not a minor procedural issue. You did not fight when the omens were bad. The gods had spoken through the animal's organs, and the message was wait. Pausanias ordered his men to hold position, to keep their shields up, to absorb the arrow fire without responding. A second goat was brought forward. The priests performed the sacrifice. The entrails were examined with the care that Greek religious practice demanded. The omens were bad again. By this point, men were dying. Not in the dozens yet, but steadily. The kind of attrition that grinds at the edges of a unit's cohesion in ways that casualty numbers do not fully capture. Every man standing in that line was watching the man next to him take arrows and doing the arithmetic of survival that soldiers cannot help doing in those moments. The Tegeans were very close to breaking formation and charging on their own. Orders or no orders. A third goat was brought forward. What Pausanias did between the second sacrifice and the third is one of the most human moments in the entire ancient historical record. Herodotus writes that Pausanias turned toward the distant temple of Hera, visible on a hill above the town of Plataea, and prayed aloud, not the formal, ritualized prayer of a public ceremony, something rawer than that. He begged the goddess not to let the Greeks be destroyed here, not to let everything they had built and defended end on this hillside with the omens still against them. Tears were running down his face. A Spartan regent, the supreme commander of the largest Greek army ever assembled, weeping openly in front of his men, in the middle of an arrow storm, asking a goddess for help because the goats kept dying with the wrong message in their organs. The modern instinct is to read this as weakness, or as theatre, or as evidence that ancient people operated in a fundamentally different relationship with reality than we do. All three of those readings miss what was actually happening on that hillside. Pausanias understood something about command that does not appear in any tactical manual, but that every genuinely effective military leader in history has understood in some form. The hardest problem in commanding an army is not tactical. It is not logistical. It is psychological. It is the problem of keeping tens of thousands of individual human beings, each one running their own internal calculation about risk and survival and the limits of what they can endure, operating as a coherent unit when every instinct those individuals possess is telling them to do something different. The phalanx was the most powerful land combat formation in the Greek world precisely because it required every man in the line to trust every other man completely. A hoplite's shield protected the man to his left as much as himself. The formation worked only when it held, The moment individual soldiers began making individual decisions, breaking left or right or forward based on their own assessment of the situation. The phalanx ceased to exist as a tactical entity and became a collection of individuals who were much easier to kill, holding that formation together while standing in an arrow storm, watching men die, with a Persian army visibly crossing the river in strength, required a level of collective discipline that went beyond any individual soldier's capacity to sustain through willpower alone. It required a framework, a reason to stand still that was larger and more authoritative than the screaming biological imperative to move. The ritual provided that framework, as long as the omens had not cleared. There was a reason to hold that every man in that line could understand and accept without question. It was not Pausanias asking them to stand there and get killed because he had decided to. It was the gods, the same gods that every man in that formation had worshipped since childhood. The same divine framework that structured the entire Greek understanding of what the world was and how it worked. You did not charge into battle against the will of the gods. That was not courage. That was hubris. And everyone present knew what happened to people who committed hubris. Pausanias may have believed in the ritual genuinely. We cannot know what was in his mind. What we can say is that whatever he believed, the ritual was doing something extremely practical on that hillside. It was keeping the formation intact at the moment, when keeping the formation intact was the only thing standing between the Greek coalition and complete destruction. The third sacrifice came back with the right signs. Herodotus records it simply. The omens were favourable. Pausanias stood up. He raised his spear. He did not need to say anything. The signal was the signal. Every man in that line had been waiting for it with the compressed energy of soldiers who had been standing in an arrow storm, absorbing punishment for long enough that the release of that energy was going to be nearly uncontrollable. The Tegeans did not wait for a second signal. They went forward immediately. Shields locked. Spears lowered. The Spartans followed, the formation closing and tightening as it accelerated. Individual men finding their place in the line by instinct and training. The phalanx reassembling itself from a defensive huddle into an offensive instrument in the space of a few seconds. What hit the Persian line was not what Mardonius had expected when he gave the order to cross the river. He had expected to catch a broken army in flight. What he caught instead was 10,000 men who had been standing in an arrow storm for the better part of an hour, held in place by ritual and discipline, and the shared conviction that the gods had finally given them permission to do what every cell in their bodies had been demanding since the first volley came in. The wicker shields along the riverbank were the first to go. The wicker shields that the Persian archers had planted in the ground along the riverbank provided reasonable cover against light infantry and cavalry, against a Spartan phalanx at full charge. They were swept aside before the Persians behind them could fully register that the barrier they had been using as cover was no longer there. The Greek formation that crashed into the Persian line was executing what ancient sources call the othismos, a term that historians still debate in its precise mechanics. If understood in its most physical sense, it describes a controlled collision in which the weight and momentum of the entire formation is transferred through the front rank into the enemy line. The men in the front were not fighting individually. They were the point of a battering ram that had the mass of thousands of men pushing behind it. The second rank pushed the first. The third pushed the second. At close range, that kind of concentrated and sustained pressure could turn even small weaknesses in protection into openings that decided whether a man lived or died. The Persians held the impact better than they should have been able to. This is the detail that Herodotus records with a care and specificity that reads as genuine respect for the soldiers on the losing side. It is also the detail that the popular version of Plataea most consistently removes, because it does not fit the narrative of inevitable Greek superiority that the victory has been dressed in for 2,500 years. The Persian infantry did not break at first contact. They did not panic. They did not run. They fought. They grabbed the shafts of Greek spears with their bare hands, not as a planned tactical response, because when a spear is coming at you at close range and you have no effective way to deflect it with what you are carrying, reaching for the shaft is the most direct thing your body tells you to do. Persian soldiers in the front ranks, being pressed by the weight of a Spartan phalanx they could not stop, grabbed the wooden shafts of Greek spears with their bare hands and tried to break them, tried to drag them offline. tried to create any disruption in the mechanical process that was killing them. Herodotus records that some of them succeeded. Some of the shafts snapped. That is what genuine courage looks like when the outcome has already been determined by factors that courage alone cannot change. Persian armour in this period was designed for a different kind of warfare. Scale armour and layered linen protected effectively against arrows, against slashing sword strokes from cavalry, against the kind of combat the Persian army had been optimised for across decades of campaigning. It was likely less suited to absorb the concentrated thrusting pressure of a Greek spear delivered with the full weight of a phalanx behind it at close range. The equipment mismatch mattered here, not because Persian soldiers lacked bravery or skill, but because they were armed and protected for a different kind of fight than the one that had found them on this particular morning, when the long spears shattered in the sustained crush of close combat. The Spartans drew their secondary weapons. The xiphos was a short, double-edged sword with a leaf-shaped blade, designed specifically for the situation that develops when a phalanx engagement moves past the spear phase into the grinding close-quarters work that filled the space where two shield walls met. It was not a weapon for open dueling. It was a weapon for the compressed space of roughly 18 inches that existed between two locked formations, where a long sword could not be swung, and where the ability to drive a short blade directly forward into whatever gap the shield wall created was the difference between living and not. Herodotus does not describe the Persians as cowards. He does not describe them as slaves driven by whips or men who did not understand what they were fighting for. He describes men fighting with genuine ferocity in a situation where genuine ferocity was not enough to change what the physics of the encounter had already decided. The dust on the plain of Plataea in high summer, churned by the hooves of Persian cavalry and the feet of tens of thousands of infantry, produced a cloud thick enough that visibility dropped to the point where men fought by sound and silhouette rather than clear sight. Commanders lost track of their units. Units lost track of their flanks. The carefully maintained formation integrity that had brought the phalanx down the hillside began to degrade in the fog of combat into something more like a sustained brawl. One in which the Greek advantages of armour depth and formation discipline still applied, but the clean mechanics of the initial impact had dissolved into a chaos that no one was fully controlling. Through all of it, Mardonius was on his white horse. Unlike Xerxes, who had watched his battles from elevated ground at a safe distance, Mardonius commanded from inside the fight. He was visible. He was moving through the combat, rallying units that were starting to give ground, redirecting pressure toward points where the Greek line looked thinner, demonstrating by his physical presence that the man responsible for this campaign had not abandoned the people fighting it. His presence was doing something that no tactical order could replicate. It was giving the Persian soldiers a reason to believe the situation could still be recovered. As long as the white horse was moving through the dust, the Persians fought. The Spartans could see it too, and they understood. With the instinct of soldiers who have spent their lives learning to read a battlefield, exactly what it meant. The battle was not going to end with the Persian line slowly grinding down under sustained pressure. The battle was going to end when that horse stopped moving. The Spartan advance began shifting its weight in the direction of the white horse. The target was identified. Everything else was secondary. There is a moment in certain battles when the fighting stops being a contest between two forces and becomes something more targeted. When one side looks across the chaos and identifies the single point that, if it fails, makes everything else irrelevant. Not a position on a map, not a ridge or a river crossing. A person. The Spartans found that point on a white horse. Mardonius had been visible throughout the engagement, moving through the dust and the noise, directing, rallying, holding the Persian line together through the force of his presence in the way that only a commander who genuinely understands that his army needs to see him can do. His personal bodyguard, a hand-picked unit of 1,000 of the finest soldiers in the Persian force, surrounded him and moved with him. A concentrated knot of elite infantry cutting down any Greek who came close enough to threaten the man at the centre. The Spartan advance shifted its weight toward the white horse, not through a formal order that anyone recorded, not through a signal from Pausanias that the sources describe. The information moved through the formation the way information moves through trained professionals who share a common understanding of what matters most. You did not need to be told. You looked at where the white horse was, and you moved toward it. The bodyguard was exceptional. They absorbed the Spartan pressure with a discipline that matched what was being applied to them, giving ground slowly, fighting for every foot, keeping the distance between the phalanx and their commander at a level that should have been survivable. The bodies accumulated around Mardonius in layers, the outermost guards dying first, then the next rank, the circle contracting but not collapsing, the white horse still visible above the dust each time the cloud shifted enough to see. A Spartan named Erimnestos reached him. Herodotus gives us the name and the deed. The precise mechanics of what happened in those final seconds are not described with the kind of detail that would settle all questions. And other ancient sources offer slightly different accounts of the moment, which is not unusual for events that occurred in the middle of a dust storm with thousands of men fighting simultaneously and no one whose primary job was to observe and record. What Herodotus is clear about is the outcome. Erimnestos, whose name carries the meaning of one who is remembered, delivered the blow that brought Mardonius down from his horse and ended his life on the plain of Boeotia. The white horse was riderless. In the seconds after Mardonius fell, before the information had fully moved through the Persian formation, the battle continued at the same intensity it had maintained since the phalanx hit the wicker shields. Men who had not yet seen or heard what happened kept fighting because they had been fighting and the man next to them was still fighting, and the basic momentum of close combat does not pause for news. Then the information moved. Ancient armies were not held together by the kind of institutional structures that allow modern military units to continue functioning effectively after they lose their commanders. The Persian force at Plataea was a professional army with genuine discipline and genuine courage, but its cohesion in battle depended significantly on the visible presence and active direction of the man who had built it, chosen it, and led it from the planning stages through 11 days of careful strategic maneuvering to this morning. When that man went down, the mechanism that had been converting individual soldiers into a coordinated fighting force developed a fault that spread through the formation faster than any messenger could have carried the news in words. The Immortals, the elite corps whose reputation rested on discipline, continuity, and resilience across decades of campaigning, looked at the dust where their commander had been and began to move backward, not in a rout at first, not in the immediate dissolution that a less disciplined force might have produced, but backward, toward the fortified camp on the northern bank, the palisade that Mardonius had built as his operational base and that now represented the only remaining structure in a situation that had just lost its organizing intelligence. The backward movement accelerated. The rout followed the retreat the way it always does, each man's decision to move faster making the man next to him feel more exposed, until the careful professional army that Mardonius had assembled with such precision across an entire winter became a river of men flowing toward a wooden wall, and the temporary safety it might offer. Now consider Artabazus. He had been commanding a reserve force of approximately 40,000 men, positioned away from the main engagement, watching the battle develop from a distance that gave him a perspective the men in the fighting line did not have. He could see the shape of what was happening in ways that the soldiers in the dust and the noise could not. He had seen the Persian advance across the river. He had seen the initial collision. He had seen the sustained grinding engagement that followed. And at the moment when the white horse went down and the Persian line began its backward movement, he had 40,000 fresh soldiers under his command. 40,000 men who had not yet fought. 40,000 men who represented, on the arithmetic of the battlefield, a force potentially large enough to change what was happening on the plain below him. He watched. He assessed. He made his decision. He turned his horse away from the battle and ordered his 40,000 men to march north. Not back to the camp, not to a new defensive position from which they might continue the campaign. North, away from Greece, toward the Hellespont and the long road home to Persia. History has called this betrayal. The Greek sources frame it in terms that leave no room for charitable interpretation. He abandoned his comrades. He left the army to its fate. He saved himself at the cost of everyone else on that plain. But there is another reading available, and it deserves honest consideration rather than dismissal as self-serving rationalization. Artabazus was a senior Persian commander, with decades of experience and a realistic understanding of what military situations look like when they have passed the point where additional force can change their outcome. What he saw from his position was not a battle that could be reversed by throwing 40,000 additional men into a confused engagement in which the Persian main force was already in retreat toward a fixed defensive position. What he saw was a campaign that had failed at its decisive moment, led by a general who was dead, in a theatre of operations that had just become strategically untenable regardless of what anyone did in the next hour. Throwing his reserve into that situation would not have saved Mardonius. It might have prolonged the engagement by a few hours. It would almost certainly have resulted in the destruction of 40,000 more soldiers, in addition to whatever losses were already accumulating on the plain. And it would have done nothing to change the fundamental strategic reality, which was that Persia had now lost the decisive engagement of the campaign, and the political and logistical foundation for continuing it had ceased to exist. Artabazus went home. He survived. He eventually returned to a position of authority in the Persian imperial system and continued a distinguished career. The men he left behind on the plain of Boeotia did not survive. History does not have a clean verdict on whether his decision represented cowardice or clarity. And we are not positioned across 2,500 years to deliver one with any confidence. What we can say without qualification is that his departure sealed the fate of everyone he left behind. The Persian retreat to the palisade was not a fighting withdrawal. It was the dissolution of an army under pursuit. Men running for the wooden walls of the camp, because the walls represented the only remaining structure in a situation that had lost all other structure. They poured through the gates, climbed the watchtowers, lined the walls with whatever missile weapons they could find, and waited. The Spartans arrived first, and here is a detail that almost no popular account of Plataea includes, because it does not fit comfortably with the image of Spartan military omnipotence that the mythology of this period has spent 2,500 years constructing. The Spartans could not take the wall. Spartan military training was extraordinary in many respects. It was not designed for siege warfare. The phalanx was a weapon built for open field engagement on level ground. Climbing a defended wooden palisade under sustained arrow fire from above was a completely different problem requiring different equipment, different techniques, and different training than anything the Spartan military system had ever prioritized. The Spartans circled the camp walls, probed for weaknesses, and lost men to the defenders on the towers above them. Unable to find a way through, the Athenians arrived. They had been fighting their own engagement on the left side of the Greek line, against the Greek city-states that had submitted to Persia and were fighting alongside the Persian force. When that engagement resolved, they moved toward the sound of the larger battle, and when they arrived at the palisade and assessed what was happening, they brought something the Spartans lacked. Athens was a city that had built walls, maintained walls, repaired walls, and thought seriously about the engineering of fortification in ways that Sparta, a land power that had historically relied on its army rather than fixed defences, had never needed to. The Athenians identified the section of the palisade most vulnerable to a concentrated assault, coordinated the attack with the methodical attention to structural problems that their tradition of urban engineering had developed, and broke through. What happened inside the camp after the breach is the part of Plataea that the historical record covers briefly, and that modern accounts tend to pass over quickly, because it does not fit comfortably into the story of Greek civilization defending itself against tyranny that this battle has been made to represent. The Greeks did not take prisoners. The Persian soldiers trapped inside the palisade had nowhere to go. The men who entered through the breach were not arriving in a mood for the kind of restraint that requires you to think of your enemy as a person deserving of mercy, rather than as the object of 8 days of thirst and hunger and the deaths of people you had fought beside. Ancient sources describe what followed as a slaughter. Herodotus records casualty claims that modern historians approach with the caution that ancient figures for events of this kind always require. But the consistency of the accounts across multiple sources, Greek and otherwise, makes the basic character of what occurred inside that palisade clear enough. The Persian wars did not end with a celebrated duel or a heroic charge into glory. They ended with tens of thousands of men trapped inside a wooden fence with nowhere to run. The fighting was over. The palisade had fallen. The plain of Plataea was covered with the evidence of what the day had produced. The kind of aftermath that battles leave and that paintings and monuments never show. Because paintings and monuments are made for the people who are not there. Pausanias walked through it to the tent of Mardonius. The tent was intact. The fighting had flowed around it and past it, and the chaos of the final assault had not reached the commander's personal quarters. What Pausanias found inside was the physical embodiment of everything that separated the Persian world from the Spartan one, and it was more disorienting, in its way, than anything he had encountered on the battlefield. The tent was not a military shelter. It was a palace that happened to be portable. Mardonius had inherited the personal equipment of Xerxes when the king went home after Salamis, and he had lived with it through an entire campaign season, with the comfort that only the resources of the wealthiest empire on earth could sustain in the field. The furniture was gold-plated. The serving vessels were silver. The fabrics hanging from the tent poles were dyed with Tyrian purple, a colour so expensive that its cost was measured not in coins, but in the weight of shellfish required to produce each yard of cloth. The floor coverings, the dining equipment, the personal appointments of every kind represented more concentrated wealth than most of the men who had just won the battle would encounter in the remainder of their lives. Pausanias stood in the middle of all of it and did something that Herodotus records as one of the defining moments of the entire conflict. He called for the Persian chefs. They were still in the camp. Whether from practical calculation, or simple shock, or some understanding that their skills made them valuable regardless of which army was currently in possession of the kitchen. The cooks and servants who had prepared Mardonius's meals throughout the campaign were present and willing to work. Pausanias gave them a specific instruction. Prepare a meal exactly as you would have prepared it for Mardonius. Full service. Everything as it would have been. Do not adjust for the new audience. Then he turned to his own Spartan cooks and gave the mirror instruction. Prepare a Spartan mess meal. Standard issue. Exactly as it would have been served in Sparta. The Persian chefs produced what they knew how to produce. Roasted meats prepared with spices that had travelled from the eastern edges of the empire. Bread baked in the Persian style. Layered and soft. Wine served in silver cups alongside sauces and accompaniments, and the kind of culinary complexity that requires dedicated specialists and equipment that most armies never carry. The table they set was an extension of the tent itself, an artifact of a civilization organized around the proposition that the people at the top of it deserved the finest things the world could produce. The Spartan cooks produced black broth, blood of pork, vinegar, and salt, boiled together into the thick, dark preparation that had been the foundation of the Spartan communal diet for generations. The meal that a visiting dignitary had reportedly tasted once and then said, with the genuine understanding that comes from direct experience, that he finally comprehended why Spartan soldiers were not afraid to die. Pausanias placed both meals on the table side by side, the full imperial Persian feast and the bowl of black broth. Then he called his commanders in and let them look at both for a moment without speaking. Then he started to laugh. What he said is preserved by Herodotus as close to a direct quotation as the ancient historical tradition produces. He pointed at the Persian feast and said that he had brought them here to show them the foolishness of the Persian leader, who had possessed all of this luxury and had come to Greece to take away the very little that the Greeks had. It is a perfect moment. It has the clean moral geometry that great historical anecdotes are supposed to have. The victorious general, surrounded by the spoils of the enemy he has just destroyed, making the philosophical point that the aggressor who had everything attacked people who had almost nothing, and lost. It is the kind of scene that travels well. It travelled from the plain of Boeotia in 479 BC through Herodotus into every account of the Persian wars written in the 2,500 years since. But here is what that moment contains that the laughter obscures. Pausanias was laughing. His commanders were laughing. The joke landed because everyone in that tent believed it. They were Spartans. They had been raised on the black broth and the rough red cloak and the deliberate rejection of the kind of softness that the tent around them represented. The Persian feast was evidence of exactly the excess that the Spartan system had always taught them to regard with contempt. They looked at the gold and the silk and the elaborate food, and they saw the proof of everything they had always believed about why Persia was ultimately beatable. But Pausanias kept looking at the table after the laughter stopped. We cannot know what was in his mind at that moment. What we can say is that Thucydides and the sources that come after Herodotus tell us what came next in Pausanias's life. And what came next changes how that scene reads when you know the ending. The man who stood in that tent and laughed at Persian excess was also the man who had stood in that tent and understood, perhaps for the first time with the full weight of his senses, what it felt like to be surrounded by beauty and wealth and the physical evidence of a civilization organized around abundance. He laughed, and somewhere beneath the laughter, something else was happening, something quieter, something that would not become visible for months and would not become undeniable for years. But it began there, in that tent, on that afternoon, in the particular silence that followed the joke. That silence, it turned out, was expensive. The battle was over. The Palisade had fallen. Greece was saved in the most complete and permanent sense that word can carry in the context of a military campaign. Persia would never again send an invasion army into mainland Greece on the scale of Xerxes' campaign. The threat that had driven Athens to evacuate its population twice, that had burned the Acropolis, that had produced the killing of Lycidas and his family on the floor of an assembly hall, was finished, and Pausanias went home. What happened to him afterward is not the story that gets told. It is not carved into monuments or painted on pottery or carried forward in the kind of historical shorthand that 2,500 years of retelling produces. The story that gets told ends with the Feast of Two Bowls, with the laughter in Mardonius's tent, with the general who understood the moral meaning of the victory and articulated it with the precision that great historical moments are supposed to have. The story that actually happened continued for years after that, and it is considerably harder to look at. The changes in Pausanias were gradual at first. Each individual shift was eccentric enough to be noted, but not dramatic enough to trigger immediate action from a leadership that was reluctant to move against the victor of the most important battle in Greek history. He stopped wearing the rough red cloak of a Spartan citizen. He began wearing Persian robes, the long, elaborate, expensive clothing of the world he had defeated. He walked through Spartan spaces and Greek-allied cities in the dress of the enemy in front of soldiers and commanders who had fought beside him at Plataea. He stopped eating communal Spartan meals, the black broth, the institutionalized austerity that was not merely a dietary practice, but a daily physical enactment of what Sparta believed about the relationship between comfort and strength. He set it aside. He began eating the way the Persian chefs had cooked in Mardonius's tent, with the complexity and the spices and the attention to pleasure that the Spartan system had spent generations teaching its citizens to regard as weakness. He hired Egyptians and Persians as personal bodyguards. He surrounded himself physically with men from the world he had defeated, creating a barrier of Persian presence between himself and the Spartan officers who tried to reach him. He began behaving. In other words, not like the man who had mocked the Persian feast in Mardonius's tent, but like the man who had hosted it. The Spartan leadership watched this unfold. They were reluctant to move against a man of Pausanias's stature and recent service without evidence that went beyond eccentricity. They needed something concrete. Then the correspondence became impossible to ignore. Thucydides is the primary source for what followed, writing a generation after the events with access to traditions and records that Herodotus did not have. According to Thucydides, Pausanias had been in communication with the Persian side since not long after Plataea, involving proposals that went significantly beyond the boundaries of what his position permitted or what Sparta could tolerate. The precise content of those communications and the exact nature of what was being negotiated are questions the ancient sources do not resolve with enough consistency to state as settled historical fact. But Thucydides presents a version that the Spartan leadership found credible enough to act on, with the kind of decisiveness that Sparta applied to threats it took seriously. They set a trap. A servant who had been approached by Pausanias as a courier agreed to work with the ephors instead. He placed himself in a location where Pausanias was scheduled to speak and recorded what was said. The evidence was secured. It was enough. Pausanias learned that his messenger had not delivered the communication. He understood immediately what that meant. He ran, not toward a military position, not toward allies or resources that his career had given him access to. He ran through the streets of Sparta toward the temple of Athena of the Brazen House, the sanctuary at the heart of the city he had saved, and he claimed the religious protection that Greek tradition extended to suppliants who reached holy ground before their pursuers. The ephors arrived at the temple doors and stopped. Greek religious law regarding sanctuary was not a formality to be set aside when it became inconvenient. Dragging a man out of a temple and killing him was not an action the Spartan state could take without consequences that extended into the city's relationship with the gods. A relationship that the Spartans, whatever else they were, took with complete seriousness. The ephors could not go in with swords. They could not drag him out into the street. So they built, stone by stone. The doorway through which Pausanias had run was sealed. The opening through which air and light and food could reach the man inside was methodically reduced and then eliminated. It was a solution that was, in its particular Spartan way, entirely logical. If the law prevented them from going in, they would make the inside into the ending. Later tradition preserves a detail that sits in the historical record like something that cannot be removed once you have encountered it. An old woman came through the crowd that had gathered to watch the ceiling of the temple. She made her way to the entrance. She was carrying a stone. She placed it on the threshold without speaking, without looking at anyone around her, without any expression that the sources think to describe. Then she turned and walked away. It was Pausanias' mother. She had come to add her stone to the wall that was going to kill her son. She did not weep publicly. She did not argue with the ephors. She did not make an appeal or offer a defense or do any of the things that a mother in a different tradition might have done when confronted with the death of her child by the deliberate action of the state. She placed her stone. She walked away. That single silent gesture was Sparta's verdict, delivered through the one relationship the state could not officially compel. It was the system completing itself at the most personal level available, and it held, inside the temple, without food, without water, without any possibility except the one the ephors had designed. Pausanias waited. The sources record that the Spartans eventually pulled his body out before he died inside, dragging him into the open air so that the pollution of a death within the sanctuary would not fall on the goddess. He died outside the temple doors, in the city he had saved, as close to nothing as a man who had commanded the greatest Greek military coalition in history could be reduced to. Now step back from the details and look at what the complete arc of this story actually shows you. Thermopylae is remembered. It is remembered in movies and novels and political speeches in the kind of cultural shorthand that crosses language barriers and centuries without losing its essential shape. 300 men. The hot gates. The beautiful death in service of something larger than any individual life. You can mention Thermopylae in almost any Western country to almost any educated person, and they will know immediately what you mean. Plataea is not remembered. Not in the same way. Not with the same immediacy and emotional force that the 300 carry. You can ask 100 educated people in any Western country to name the battle that actually drove the Persian invasion out of mainland Greece. The engagement that secured the survival of the civilization that would eventually produce democracy and philosophy in the scientific tradition. And most of them will not be able to do it. The gap between those two facts is not accidental. It reflects something real about what human beings want from their history and what we find genuinely difficult to absorb from it. Thermopylae is clean. It ends at exactly the right moment. The 300 die before any of them has the chance to go home and put on Persian robes or write letters to the enemy or be sealed into a temple by their own mother. Their heroism is permanent and uncontaminated because they did not live long enough for life to complicate it. They are frozen at the perfect instant, and that perfection is what has made them useful as a symbol for 2,500 years. Plataea has a morning after. It has tens of thousands of men who won the most important battle in Greek history and then had to go home and figure out what to do with the rest of their lives. It has 35,000 helots who fought and bled and carried the operational weight of the Spartan army and were handed back to the system that had enslaved them when the campaign was over. It has Pausanias standing in Mardonius' tent, laughing at Persian excess, and then spending the next decade becoming the thing he laughed at. It has a coalition that nearly destroyed itself from the inside on the night before the battle, and was only saved by the particular combination of Spartan stubbornness and Persian misreading that happened to align at the right moment. It has the truth. The full truth. Not the selected truth. And the full truth of a military victory is always harder to carry than the clean image of a noble defeat. Thermopylae is clean because it ends before anything gets complicated. Plataea is forgotten because it does not. The question that this battle asks is not really about tactics or armour, or the relative merits of different military formations. The question Plataea asks is about what victory does to the people who achieve it, about whether the thing you fought to protect survives the fighting intact, about whether the version of yourself that emerges from the process of winning is recognisably the same as the version that entered it. Pausanias entered Plataea as the embodiment of everything the Spartan system was designed to produce. He won. And then the winning showed him something about the world that the Spartan system had not equipped him to process. And he could not stop looking at it. And eventually the looking became wanting, and the wanting became action. And the action ended with a sealed door and his mother's stone on the threshold. Leonidas is remembered because he died before that discovery found him. Pausanias is forgotten because he lived long enough to make it. The 35,000 helots are forgotten for a different reason. Not because their story is complicated by moral failure, because the people who wrote the history did not consider their story worth the ink. They appear in Herodotus as a number. They disappear from the record as a number. What they thought about what they were doing. What they hoped the experience might produce for them and their families. What the particular strangeness of being handed a weapon by the people who owned you and told to fight for the civilization that had enslaved your parents and their parents before them felt like from the inside. None of that survived. The victory monument did not include their names. The victory narrative did not include their perspective. They saved Greece. Greece did not save them. That is Plataea. Not a simple story about courage defeating tyranny. Not a clean narrative about the superior values of a free people breaking the power of an empire built on submission. A story about what it actually costs to win. About who pays the price and who gets to keep the winnings. About the distance between the image a victory projects and the reality of what it was made from and what it left behind. The plain of Boeotia is farmland now. The Asopus River still runs where it ran on that summer morning in 479 BC. The ruins of ancient Plataea are there if you know where to look, marked by foundation stones and the kind of informational signage that commemorates places most tourists drive past without stopping on the way to somewhere more famous. Nobody stops there to make movies. Nobody writes speeches that begin with Plataea the way they begin with Thermopylae. Nobody has built anything lasting around the memory of the 100,000 who actually won. We gave the glory to the 300 who died beautifully. We let the rest of the story, the real story, the whole story, settle quietly into the ground alongside the bones of the men and women who lived it. Maybe that says something about the battle. Maybe it says something about us. Maybe the most honest thing you can say about Plataea. After all of it, after the thirst and the chaos and the goat and the white horse and the sealed temple and the mother's stone, is that the reason we do not remember it is exactly the same reason we should, because it is true, and the truth of how civilization is actually saved. By whom and at what cost and with what consequences for everyone involved, has never been the kind of story that the people who benefit most from civilization find easy to tell.